Hello and welcome to the 59th edition of Half Hour, a podcast starring me, John Paul Logidici, as your host. In today's episode, I will discuss preserving history with David Maloney. Thank you very much for coming on.
Absolutely.
I really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
So why don't you just go ahead and tell us about yourself, kind of get us started on your journey in preserving history, things like that, why it's important to you, and you can talk about your education, stuff like that. So
Sure, yeah. So I started out pretty young with the collecting thing. My parents always took me to a lot of museums. We went on a lot of road trips when I was growing up. So I've been to 39 states. I've been to thousands of museums and historical sites, and that's kind of how I got introduced to the field of. No, you're all right. The field of like history and collecting. And then I still remember, I think I was like 14 years old. I went to the flea market, and at this point I'd been kind of looking at like videos on YouTube about like military history, World War II history, Civil War history, kind of getting introduced into that like world. And I went to the flea market and I saw an ammo box or something and like a bayonet for sale. And I was like, well, I love reading about these things and watching videos about other people talk about them. Why can I not just own them? Why can't I just own pieces of this history? So that's kind of how I got into the collecting field and loving history, and I've tried to turn that into a career now. In terms of education, I'm currently majoring in history, political science, and international political studies with a minor in philosophy at Ashland University. I'm a member of the Ashbrook Scholars Program there, which is a program specializing in the social studies majors. I'm a member of a couple of other clubs. I'm an elected official on our student senate there. And I also just got hired on as the curator of the Numismatic Center on campus, which is a historical coin and currency museum. So I do a lot there, and then I'm also an intern curator at the local historical society here in Strongsville, where I manage the Military History Museum that I worked to build over the last 2 years, pretty much.
And that was brilliant. I mean, I remember when I met you, it was at that event when you were, talking a little bit about your efforts to preserve the history there. And,
yeah.
I have to say it was such an analytical, really spot-on presentation.
I appreciate it.
There was no lack of detail. You really went and you took every single little thing and put it together for people to kind of digest. And I think it's great that there's people who are doing this. I think that the world needs more people that are cataloging and making sure that we're keeping track of everything that we can.
Yeah, well, and that's the crazy thing too, is that a lot of the times, like as a historian, we spend all the time studying the things that other people didn't care about. So like everyone, like famous officials write memoirs, or people like with important events, like for instance like Pearl Harbor or 9/11 or something like that. A lot of average people will keep newspapers because the average person can understand the significance of a major event. But where a lot of the gaps start to form for like a historian studying a certain period, a certain event, are the day-to-day life, the day-to-day occurrences, the day-to-day items, how people live their lives, the things they talked about.
Right.
Those are the things that people don't care about, and that's still a pervasive problem today. People throw stuff away, people forget or don't care, so that's what people do now. People like me that catalog.
I remember in the presentation you talked, ad nauseum about some of these veterans who came home, and you had all the information about their family, about where they're from, etc. And even more specific than that, which is kind of what you were alluding to there.
Mm-hmm.
I did want to jump on the coin thing real quick.
Sure. Yeah.
The numismatic side.
Yeah.
I'm like kind of a self-taught collector myself.
Oh, really?
It's funny we haven't actually gotten to talk about that just in general, but
Yeah.
I would love to ask you what your favorite, or the one that sticks out the most. Like what design? U.S. Let's stick with U.S.
Okay.
Because I do know a fair bit about foreign money, and it's interesting because I'm always so intrigued with European history and even East Asian history.
Mm-hmm.
I'm European, obviously. That's my background, so I'm most interested in that side of my family if we're talking genealogy wise. But when it comes to the coins, it's the exact opposite. I love the American coins.
Mm-hmm.
Like maybe it's because it's been the same, the whole time. The same currency. Because I know, for example, I'm Italian, right? And they have the lira, they have the euro. You go back further. But yeah, what would you say your favorite kind of coin to study or like design? would be?
I mean, that's a tough question. For me, I've always been like I'd consider novice collector. I've collected coins and currency on the side from time to time, more for the history aspect than it is like trying to collect every type of coin. Because, so much history is tied within coins and currency. Like you look at a dollar bill or a coin, for instance, and it can tell you a plethora of things, not just about the physical item itself, but of the period of which it came from, whether it's the material or the design of the coin or the writing on a dollar bill or whatever. In terms of a coin
Sometimes
design,
you have silver notes.
Yeah.
It'll say silver.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, it might be kind of basic. I love the Walking Liberty.
Okay, yeah.
That one's one of my favorites.
I wouldn't call it basic. That's a good one.
It's a very classic, very just American design.
Yeah.
So
yeah,
I've always really liked that one.
You want to know which one I thought was interesting was the quarter before Washington.
Oh yeah.
So what do you know anything about the image itself? Like, who is the man standing there? Is it George Washington? Because I remember seeing portraits of George Washington similar to the one on the coin there.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know who that is. I know Walking Liberty is just Lady Liberty.
Yeah.
It's not a real person, but I don't know who that person is on the quarter. I'm not sure.
I wish I could say that I know. Maybe when I do more reading, I'll find out. Like
we'll have to do that.
Like with the museum, I'm there more so for the museum side of things. But of course, as being a curator of a museum, you're also pledging to learn everything you can about the content or subject that museum is presenting. So
right.
I still have a little bit of a learning curve because, again, I've appreciated coins and currency as a side hobby, perhaps, but I haven't properly dug deep into studying all these different types of coins and things like that. So maybe I'll have an answer for you later.
That's a design that sticks out to me. I have to say my favorite has always been the Mercury dime. I love the
classic.
Mercury dime.
Yeah,
that's a good one too. Another one is is it the Morgan? I think the Morgan $50. I love how big they were. Yeah, that was a good one. I feel like our currency was absolutely beautiful in this era, and I think it was not like I love looking at them, and there's so much history associated with it. And, for everyone listening, if you take a silver quarter and a normal quarter and you drop them on the table, the silver quarter will have a different sound. It'll be a little higher pitch.
Yep, because of the silver.
Because of the silver content. That's how you know. And also, it's before 1965. So if you find a coin that's before then, it'll have that. One thing, we'll get into the cataloging here. One thing I think you and I have in common is I actually did an entire kind of catalog on my university's kind of student council history.
Oh, really?
When I became president over there, I inherited a system that was kind of a mess. It had, several different kind of areas where we were storing files. So we had OneDrive, we had Dropbox, we had local files on people's computer, Google Drive, the whole 9 yards. It was everywhere. We had all these different kind of places to store files.
Yeah.
So what I really wanted to do was take all of these files and put Canva, that's another one. It was stored everywhere. One of my goals was to take all of the files and to put them onto the OneDrive, which is what the college so I remember I went to IT and I said, can you add me to the OneDrive? And they eventually did, and they put me in there, and I had the rest of student council on there, and I ended up making all sorts of folders. I pulled all the pictures, I put everything in there. I labeled, I dated everything. So I feel like that's where we kind of see things very similarly. One of my main achievements was pulling all of the disparate files everywhere. I remember I went to the library and I pulled out books that were they had kind of scrapbooks of photos that weren't on computers yet, and I scanned them and I put them in there. And I remember I took the Constitution, I printed it out 5 times and just put it in the library. I put it in the student lounge. I put one in the lobby. I just wanted it everywhere. I wanted people to be able to pick it up and kind of be like, oh, okay, so this is what we're doing. My goal was to really build a system that would last, to build a proper foundation. That was my goal with Student Council and the Constitution that we have there. The school was too small. We did away with all of the nomenclature about committees and such. It wasn't really such a big deal, I don't think. I wanted to keep it stupid simple. People could get in and be like, let's work. Let's have something. How do we replace somebody who resigns? How is that done? We codified that. I remember we had a constitutional convention. The nerd in me was going crazy about it. But I think one of the main pivotal things was I put everything on the drive. Pictures, videos, events, when the events happened, where they happened, who helped organize them. I made a catalog of all the former presidents. I think I was number 27. I think that was my number.
So young Senate then.
Yeah, I was number 27 for the presidency. I don't know. I know I have the files on my computer. Isn't that funny? Like, I forget these things now. It was a little while ago. But yeah, I remember I inherited a system that was doing everything online. It was, I don't think it was very engaging for students. I think the people running it were very nice people. I just don't think it was the right direction. And I remember when I took over, one of my main goals was we have a team. Each of us is good at something. I took a very big kind of firm hand on cataloging. Maybe not the best job, but my goal was to just put everything in one place, and maybe someone who's a little more talented could go in and kind of figure everything out. But sure. I'm curious to hear maybe what your first project was, because after what you showed us at that Strongsville library, it was incredible to see how you put everything together. You have it in a building. It's very professional. You have the glass, and people really see that. And I think that these are some hidden talents that really help a country kind of establish itself,
Mm-hmm.
And there needs to be more people like you that are out there and putting the work in to ensure that our history isn't getting forgotten,
Yeah.
And we're in a time period now where everything's digital, A lot of the documents, a lot of the things that we see are not tangible, and it's good that you're kind of putting that effort in.
Well, and it's certainly right that there's almost a line that you have to determine where it lies as a curator of a certain institution, because it's always important to maintain the physical copies of documents.
Right.
And this ranges all the way from like a family level, like old marriage certificates, old photographs, family histories, things like that, all the way up to like a national level. Like, for instance, of course, we have the National Archives that manages like the Declaration, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, all of these important founding documents. But as an actual historian or a curator, you have to figure out where that line lies between, okay, is this worth keeping? Is this significant in itself, being this physical document? Or is this something that you don't really need a physical version of? This is something that we can digitize and then dispose of the original for space and cost purposes. I know just in my time working with the Strongsville Historical Society, we've found a lot of documents that we didn't even know we had, because people hadn't been digitizing them. So you might have an impeccable system managing your physical archives, but the modern expectation for the field is that, of course, you have the physical management, but you also need to have the digital management. Every single time you touch a historical document, you are further damaging the document, but then you're also going to be reducing the longevity of that document. So, for instance, like the Declaration of Independence, that original one is on display. However, they don't always handle that original one. We have reproductions, we have digital copies. And that goes for literally any historical document.
Right.
Every time you touch it, you risk tearing a corner, leaving oil from your skin, creasing it, a million other things that could happen. Even just like moving it from a space that's with a humidity-controlled, darker environment with no UV light, even if you're just taking it out for a couple of hours, that's further damaging it more than it would have had to be. So when you get a new document and you're filing it like in a museum or an archival system, you should look at the original document, evaluate its condition, determine if there's going to need to be any kind of steps taken in terms of conservation or restoration to prolong the longevity of it without undermining the historical significance or historical accuracy of the piece. But then also you need to digitize it, because once you have it digitized, you no longer need to handle that original. Only in specialized cases where you might need to see it for specific reasons or
maybe
to take
the
care of
digital
it.
doesn't, maybe there's a pixel missing or something in the sense where it's like, is that an R or is that
Sure,
an N?
exactly. Like you're gonna maintain that original document for longevity and historical purposes and additional references in case for whatever reason.
And it's also
your
the
database
history
goes
of it.
down.
You know, I understand. Like the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution.
Yes.
Those original documents, yeah, we got to keep those climate controlled, locked up, you know, pressurized, you know, whatever we have to
Exactly.
do. It's so important. What is a specific example maybe you can give me or the audience like that you worked with that was really fascinating for you? I mean, I know, granted, we're in Strongsville, and it's it's a city in Ohio, and it's not like we're handling like some ancient European charter or some ancient Chinese scroll, you know. But what was something that you really like? Wow, this is incredible. I gotta say, one time I had an atlas from 1942.
Oh yeah.
And I turned the page and it ripped. And
Yeah.
it was a big rip.
That's a common problem.
And I was like, oh no. I was
Yeah.
like, oh.
Well, and as a side note, actually, paper that ranges from like around the 1890s to the 1990s, that one specific century, the way paper production was done was it had a certain chemical makeup to it. It was done to not only make paper production easier and cheaper, but also it was supposed to make it more pure, to take out more of the pulp and have a more chemical base of the paper.
But it's flimsier, isn't it?
But exactly that. Now we're seeing, like even documents I handle from the 1940s or 50s, literally no matter what you do, even if it's in perfectly like humidity controlled, temperature controlled, in the dark, everything's perfect, eventually that document will entirely crumble into dust simply because of the chemical makeup. And I could go into the whole science of it, but essentially the chemicals that they use to make up that paper causes the paper to degrade simply because of oxygen. It causes the bonds within the chemical makeup of the paper to deteriorate simply from sitting out in oxygen, and then that paper, no matter what you do, will just simply fade away and into dust. So now, since 1990 or 1992, they passed a law stating that they have to change the paper composition to make it more uniform with all other paper producers and allow it to not just...
More durable.
Exactly, more durable. It's not going to fall apart over time, but a lot of these significant documents for the last 100 years or so are all falling apart.
What was one of the oldest documents you handled?
Perhaps one of the oldest documents I've ever handled was I handled a document from the 1700s. It was a letter written from Abigail Adams to
incredible.
John Adams. I
That's
was visiting the
incredible.
National Archives, and I got a behind-the-scenes tour in their vault.
Did they make you wear the gloves and everything?
Well, fortunately, we didn't have to wear gloves. They were all in plastic protecting, so we didn't need to worry about that. But in terms of like in Strongsville, I think one of the oldest documents I handled was from 1732.
That's incredible.
It was a land grant from a family that moved from Connecticut and had bought what was considered the Western Reserve at the time of Connecticut, had bought a sect of land in what is now Strongsville, and eventually they moved here at the settling of Strongsville, and around 1812 is when it was first settled, 1814 is when it was established.
Yeah, very few people know about the land grants from the original 13 colonies. You know, because you just see the map of them straddling the Atlantic coastline, but Virginia had a sea to sea charter, you know?
Yeah.
And I think some of the early maps of Virginia, I don't know if you know which one I'm referring to, it looks like a funnel that goes up into like British Columbia and then out toward, you know which one I'm talking about. That goes out to California, and then it obviously got shaved down over the time. Massachusetts went through Michigan. Like there was like a strip of Michigan that like used to be Massachusetts, and Connecticut was right under it, and it went through this part of Ohio as well.
Yeah.
And that's obviously the Firelands. They call this area the Firelands, I think, because in Connecticut the British burned a lot of stuff down, and they moved out here, or maybe it's because here they set things on fire. I don't know which one's which. I forget what I watched, but they talked about how a common name in this area is the Firelands. You've heard of that, right? Like, you know what I'm talking about?
I do know what you're talking about. As for like the specific history, I don't recall off the top of my head. I wish I could remember.
I gotta read more. Yeah, I gotta read more about it. And this was another thing I was gonna get to. With the coins, I've handled some coins that are in the protector and there's like a circle cut out, and you could see it just hanging out in there, and you could flip the cardboard over.
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah.
For me, it's always been more valuable to feel it and to touch it and to hold
Yeah.
it. You know, and I mean like really feeling it with your hands. And I know it destroys it. I do know that. You know, I find a wheat penny these days, and I'm like, I get so excited. You know, I always flip it around, see what the mint mark is. You know, it's amazing how many wheat pennies will go. You'll find, you know, even now, even in 2024. And I remember I went to an arts and crafts store in Massachusetts, and I got a buffalo nickel back, and I was like, wow.
Yeah.
I was like, that's uncommon, you know.
Yeah.
I don't think I've ever found one of those. Maybe once before that.
Funny enough, so during COVID in about 2020, I think, I was looking for things to do, and I was like, okay, I'll go to the bank and I'll get like $20 in pennies, and I'll just go and sit in front of the TV and sort pennies, because it was just something for me to do, something for me to fill out my coin collection that I hadn't given a lot of attention to.
Right, right.
So I don't know if you know a lot about like wheat cents and all that, but one of the pennies I found a 1909 wheat cent, which was the
VDB.
It wasn't a VDB, but it was a 1909. First year ever of the wheat cent, the Lincoln wheat cent.
1908 was the Indian head, right? It was the Indian head penny.
Yes, the Indian head was through 1908.
Wow.
So 1909 is when they introduced the Lincoln cent, and I found one of those just in a roll from the bank. So
it's ancient, you know. It's so old. You ever think about how old that is? Like how many decades it's gone through, how that thing has seen so much history.
Yep.
You know, I think I found one that was like 1911, 1912. You know,
Yeah.
I think somewhere in there, early teens. So I know what you're saying. It is so fascinating to hold these things. You know, and I love it because there's not a lot at stake with the wheat pennies, you know.
Yeah.
They're not worth a whole lot, you know, and you can kind of just appreciate it for what it is, you know. The Indian heads are beautiful too. I love one thing I do love about those coins is, you know, even the further back you go, the more I love the coins that have they're not like smooth. Like our coins now, you run your thumb on it and there's not a lot of like ridges. Like, you know, even I can't lie to you, the quarters now, there are so many different variations of these quarters. Like you have national parks, you have you know, you have the states, you know, and I thought that was cool growing up, but I feel like it's just too many now. Like it's so much. But you know, back in the day, you'd run your thumb across the back of an Indian head penny or like a Morgan silver dollar, and they're so well defined, you know. You know, United States of America. It's almost like a form of Braille, you know, like but you feel it, and you can really feel the indentations that were made on the coins, you know, and preserving the coins are so important. And you know, we can get into the more you know, fiscal side of it, where it's like, should we even have physical money? And I'm always a big fan of physical money. I think it's great. I think it's amazing. I'm kind of a proponent of more coins. Like I like the coins. I think we should be very, you know, liberal with our designs and kind of change things and have some cool designs on there, like because it's just fascinating to me, you know. What would you say you know, other than the Strongsville project, which, you know, everyone in the area, if anyone ends up watching this around here, please go check it out. It's fascinating. But I have yet to do it yet. You have to take me. But from what you showed me in the PowerPoint, it's fantastic, you know. What would you say like one of your premier projects was, you know, other because you gave me the whole presentation with that one.
Yeah.
But what would you like? What's another thing? You know, I remember you were telling me a bit about, you know, cataloging firearms. You know, that was an interesting story. Maybe not for here, obviously, but
Yeah.
But yeah, I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, the firearm project is still an ongoing project. It's a private collection, so I can't really talk much about that one. But I think like one of my favorite things to do is my private collection as well. Of course, I like museums are what I like to do. My future is preserving history and interpreting it and designing exhibits for the general public to be able to learn from. The reason that I collect for my own personal collection, as well as what I want to do for museums, is I think that for as boring as sometimes a history class might be in high school or something like that, Most of the times because you're reading about a story in a textbook or you're watching a very dry documentary or something like that. And there's no way for you to physically or emotionally connect to that person or experience.
You're trying to make this more engaging.
Very much so. And
Yeah.
that's the reason that I'm going into museums is because, like you were just talking about, touching the coins. Like, it's nice to preserve them
It's
behind
engaging,
plastic,
yeah.
but it's engaging to actually touch the coin and feel the history that that coin saw.
And that's why I was talking about feeling the ridges on the coin, because you can get a sense of like what the era was all about. So it was a very well defined design, I guess. Like the metal that was used, the silver is still like rock solid on a lot of these coins. And that's so pivotal, because I can't lie to you. Whenever you hand me a coin that's in the sheath and you tell me not to take it out, and very young, I knew the value of not taking it out of the film. Do not take it out.
Sure.
But it's more engaging, to be
Yeah.
able to, at least for me. So that's an example for me. So I think it's great you're trying to do that.
Yeah, but to answer your question, like of a project I work on, my personal YouTube channel, which I've told you a little bit about, War History Geek, I mostly focus on talking about individual, really obscure items. So that's what I really enjoy because, for one thing, the two main things I focus on are obscure pieces of equipment or things like that maybe people in the collecting hobby know about, but not very much. And then anyone outside of the collecting hobby of military artifacts,
right over there.
no idea.
Yeah.
Nobody's ever heard of them. So I like to take something obscure. I'll spend 20 hours researching it, going to all these obscure forums from 20 years ago and finding books that were published 40 years ago that nobody knows about. And something that, like, who doesn't have any research skills would never be able to find anything on. I'll do hours of research and compile it all into a video where people can go and learn about those things.
What's an obscure object that you studied?
Well, for right now, I'm currently working on a video on North Vietnamese sun helmets used during the Vietnam War.
Sun helmets.
Yeah, they're made out of like a plastic, kind of like resin compound, and they were just very cheaply produced to be able to protect them from the sun. No kind of like plating. There's literally no kinds of protection. It's basically plastic, but it was protect them from the sun in the jungle.
The NVA.
Yes, yeah. Another one I've worked on is the World War II United States Ethicel canteen. Ethicel was a very early experimental form of plastic in the 1940s, and at the outbreak of World War II, from World War I until the late 30s, canteens have always been made out of aluminum because it doesn't really oxidize, it's durable, yet still light, and it's easy to produce items out of it because you're stamping it out of the aluminum. But the problem was, entering World War II, they needed to use aluminum for aircraft. So they started developing all kinds of different things.
That's why you have the steel penny as well for the copper.
Yeah. But like in World War II, they experimented with porcelain plating. So they actually issued canteens that were steel or iron and then plated in porcelain, which was a failure, and I have a couple of those. But the Ethicel canteen was even more rare because it was this experimental plastic. They were trying it for the first time, and overall it was a failure as well. You ran into problems with durability. People would land on them, they'd get crushed. A lot of them were issued to the Pacific Theater, so a lot of them would start to melt even and get very soft under the hot heat. And also you had problems with the chemicals in the plastic actually leaching into the water in the canteen and making the water taste bad. So a lot of people never heard of them. They were recalled. A lot of them were destroyed, but they're still out there. So I found one by chance in a random antique mall in Tennessee a couple of years ago. And I picked it up and I did like 30 hours of research and I put together a video.
These by the way, that's awesome. Like I think that's really cool. The idea that you can go to some store in Tennessee, or even I did a lot of antiquing in New Hampshire. Mm-hmm. When I lived in Europe, you would have loved these stores out in Europe.
Oh, I've done some antiquing in Germany before.
Oh, it's so much fun. Yeah, it's so much fun. I remember I went with my family to Karlstein Castle. It's a castle outside of Prague. I said to them, I'm like, guys, you're in Europe, got to take you to the castle that I know like the best about. That's like kind of like best fairy tale you can get, So I took them there, and there was an antique store on the way there, so we all went inside. They had World War II paraphernalia from the Soviets, from Germany, from Italy, from America, France, the UK, Czech Republic's right in the middle of it all, and that there were things, pins, hats, gloves, all sorts of objects, the canteens, like everything, it was all there. Very overwhelming for someone like me, but I remember I used to go antiquing with my mom when I was a kid, and it was so much fun. I bought like this typewriter, but it was one you had to plug into the wall.
Oh yeah, a word processor.
Yeah. So I remember I gave that to my buddy because I remember my dad was like, "Get it out of my house," because he's like, "It's just sitting here, it's doing nothing. We got too much stuff in this house." I was like, "Okay," so I gave it to one of my best friends back home. But I think you're definitely a lot more interested in these kinds of things than me. But I do find an interest in, like, you pick up an object and you wonder, what it's seen, what happened, when this was going on. I find particular interest in the kind of World War I era. That's somewhere where I find it to be just turn of the century. The world was in a totally different paradigm. I mean, if we get into the history of it, you had a series of continent-spanning empires, across the world. The British, the French, the Germans, the Russians, right? Austria, Hungary, Italy, the Ottomans. On and on and on it goes. Even Portugal, they had a pretty sizable colonial empire at the time, and you had the World's Fairs out in Chicago, and you had like all these countries bringing projects in, and then World War One kind of that really put a stop to like whatever was going on, whatever that worldview. I mean, you had. I would argue, the Central Europe pretty much collapsed after that. I mean, it was, Russia became a very communist country. Germany was very unstable, which then led to World War II. You had all sorts of new nation states crop up in Central and Eastern Europe. In my history class in Europe, we talked a lot about this. We talked a lot about how the emergence of these new countries really kind of created so much change, and how a lot of history got lost in the interwar period. That's another period I find very fascinating. I remember I asked you at this event, I'm like, what front was the most interesting for you? I remember I asked you that. I forget what you said though. Sorry.
At the presentation, you asked me what my favorite battle is to study.
Okay.
Which, at the time, I said Iwo Jima. But
that is a good one.
It's very difficult to choose a singular battle because so many of them are very similar, but at the same time, there's an equal amount that are all so individually special in like whether it was tactics used, equipment used, how the victory was won, that kind of thing. But in terms of a theater, like if I had to choose from the Second World War, the Pacific theater, in my opinion, is a little bit more interesting to study. And that's not to say that the European theater isn't interesting.
Well, it was very unique, too.
Well,
It was like there was a lot of jungle fighting, a lot of island hopping.
Well, that's the thing, because going into the Second World War, that was uniquely new, not only for the United States, but for a lot of the world.
Japan had never done something like that before either. I mean, they blitzed the Western colonies in Southeast Asia.
Mm-hmm.
They were largely ungarrisoned. You had Hong Kong and Singapore, but you're right. Yeah, this was a very new.
It was uniquely new in the tactics used, the technology used, and especially for Americans or British going and fighting in the Pacific theater, fighting in these dense jungles with constant rain. And then also the Japanese with the tactics they used. The Japanese, they used nighttime raids, which was generally unheard of up until the Second World War. And of course, that had been used previously, but just out of nowhere, out of the jungle, there would be a bonsai charge where these guys are running at you with swords and bayonets, ready to chop you up instead of shoot you from a distance. You had all kinds of fear tactics and psychological warfare used by the Japanese. And not to get too brutal, but like the Japanese still using techniques of like beheadings and torture and things like that with POWs.
Yeah.
It was almost a carryover of a bygone era from that region of the world that was entirely new and in a new way entirely frightening for American GIs going over there for the first time.
We're getting close to the end, actually. I mean, see that, I definitely, we should definitely do a part two. I want to ask more about your feelings on like ancient history, like what we've really lost, I was listening to a Rogan podcast the other night. He was talking about, who was he with? He was with this Graham Hancock, that's his name.
Oh, not Graham Hancock.
Yeah, pseudo-archaeologist.
Yeah.
So, there's some controversy there. They were talking about the invention of the wheel, and they were talking about ancient Egypt,
Yeah.
when the wheel was invented with respect to them. They were making the argument that the wheel was not yet around at the construction of the pyramids, but it was around for when you had Ramesses and Moses, because they had the chariots. The Egyptians had the chariots with the wheels on them, obviously. But what are your thoughts on some of the lost history? Is there anything that sticks out, like Göbekli Tepe? That's a very interesting place for me to think about. Some of the ancient ruins that dot the landscape in the Middle East, especially.
Yeah. Well, when it comes to lost history, and I forget where I read the statistic, but there's a statistic out there where some people argue that we've only discovered like 25% of human history. And of course, like, how can you know how much you've discovered if you don't know how much there is to discover? And there's a lot of like theoretical things with that. But in terms of ancient history, there's still so much left to learn and discover. For the longest time, I think a lot of historians and archaeologists had a very bad track record of trying to interpret and study ancient history based off of bad science, whether it was racially based science and assuming that, well, they weren't white and they didn't have the intellectual understanding that we have. So they couldn't possibly have been capable of this ingenious
it's a
engineering
huge folly.
project.
It's a huge folly because you can look around the world at the pyramids at what is it, Chichen Itza. I think it's in Guatemala. I think one of these.
I believe so.
You know what I'm talking about, right? Mexico has them
Yeah.
too. Angkor Wat in Cambodia. You look at some like Mansa Musa of the what was it, the Ghanan Empire, the Mali Kingdom. Yeah, it's a huge folly. There's so much history that we just have lost. You look at a lot of the structures in India and in China.
Mm-hmm.
It's fascinating. I don't know if you want to kind of close up here.
Sure.
We're getting to the end. If you want to leave the audience with like a message.
I mean, if I had a message, if you're interested in history, even if you're not interested in history, just take a moment to think about history, whether it's your family history, your community, the nation, or the world. And next time, like maybe you walk into an antique store, maybe you're looking through an old family scrapbook, maybe you come across something in your home that you didn't know about. Take some time to think about the past that item holds. Take some time to reject that idea of what history is supposed to be, this boring idea of, a teacher droning on in a classroom and a documentary maybe your grandpa's watching on the TV or something, and try to bring that history alive. Try to connect to the person that item might have belonged to. Try to connect to that event. Imagining, like, for instance, like a Civil War soldier, a 16-year-old kid entering the service and fighting the Civil War. Imagine yourself as a 16-year-old, how immature you were, how little responsibility you had. But then imagine yourself in that person's shoes, fighting in the Civil War at the same age.
Yeah.
Just take some time to put yourself in the shoes of the people in that history, and I think that history will start to come to life for you. I think that you might actually start to find history somewhat intriguing. So next time you have a chance to do that, I really can't recommend it enough.
Thank you for coming on the show, David.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Have a good one, guys. Thank you very much. Remember to like, comment, subscribe. David here is doing a really good job. We need more people in the world like David who are working on history and making sure that people, really understand, what's going on. So like, comment, subscribe. Look out for the next one. Peace.